Hey guys, what's going on? It's Jay, and in this video I'm going to be comparing the Canon R10 to the Sony ZV-E10 in low light situations. So I'm going to do video testing and I'm going to do photo testing as well. I'm also going to test the autofocus and audio just so you guys can see how these two cameras compare. As far as the colors go, you know, the performance, the autofocus, the audio quality as well. So let's just get right into it. So I'm recording right now with both the Sony ZV-E10 and the Canon R10, and I just wanted to compare these two in the studio environment, super low light. So let me just shut this other light off here. So we're looking at, on the Sony ZV-E10, I have it in program auto mode. I am shooting in 4K at 24p. I have the white balance hard set to 5000. Now, I do have it on auto ISO. So the Sony ZV-E10 right now, because I'm using the old kit lens, which is an 18 to 55mm kit lens, very comparable to the Canon R10 kit lens. The Sony, by default, when in program auto, sets the shutter speed to 1/50th of a second and f3.5 when at 18mm. Now, the Canon R10, if I press the shutter button here, I'm in program auto mode basically for video on the R10 as well, not manual mode. And the settings are ISO 12800 for the auto, and it's at f4.5, and it's at 1/30th of a second. So both cameras have this feature called Enable Slow Shutter, which will slow that shutter down in really low light situations. So the Canon is choosing to do that more than the Sony in this particular environment, but they are both at 12,800 now, and they are both hard set for the same white balance. So you can see how much different the skin tones look. You know, we'll see what it looks like on the computer, but just looking at the screens here, it's definitely not close. Now, I just wanted to show you the autofocus ability in this low light situation. So check out the Sony first. And I have facial recognition turned on. There we go. Now here's the Canon. Based on that, they both look like they work pretty much identical. They're both silent. I can't hear the autofocus on either camera at all when it's doing that transition. Alright guys, so I want you to see what it looks like when I turn the key light on and there's a drastic change in exposure. Watch this. See how each camera handles it. So you can see the Sony got down to business a little bit quicker than the Canon, but they did both adjust. Now, in this scenario, you know, it looks pretty good. I think the Sony actually looks a little bit better on the screen. I can see a little bit more detail in the background. The Sony is now still at 1/50th of a second, f3.5, and it's at ISO 400. Now the Canon is at ISO 500, 1/30th of a second, and f5.6. So that's what the cameras chose to do in auto. So let me put the cameras in manual mode and I will set them to the exact same number, and we'll do this again quick. Alright guys, so now I have both cameras in manual mode. So they're both set hard to 1/50th of a second, f4.5. However, I do still have it on auto ISO. So the ISO on the Sony can go all the way up to 32,000. The ISO on the Canon is locked out at 12,800. It doesn't want to go any higher than that. In addition, the Sony has the dynamic range optimizer. I can still use that on the Sony, whereas on the Canon that feature is grayed out now when in manual mode. Let's see how it works when I flip the key light on here. And also note the audio difference, if you can hear any. So again, the Sony just reacts a little bit faster to this, you know, face priority multimetering when switching light sources like this. So if you're going from shadows to bright to shadows, looks like the Sony might be a better option. It's possible I'm missing some feature in the R10 that I'm not aware of, but I've gone through the menu so many times now, I don't see anything to adjust this particular thing. But again, I could be wrong. So right now, both cameras are still at 1/50th of a second, f4.5. Now they're at ISO 400. The Sony is floating between 400 and 500. Alright guys, so now I'm just doing one more test. I have the monitors off and the room is pretty much dark. The only light that's trickling in is behind the blinds there, you know, the curtains. So the ISO is maxed out on the R10 at 12,800. It's also maxed out on the ZV-E10 at 32,000. So I'm in manual mode, but here's what the difference is. Now I'm using auto white balance. So I just wanted to show you what the skin tones look like when they're set to auto, because when I had them hard set to 5,000, they were clearly different. So now on auto, here's what the difference is. Now, let me just turn the key light on, and we should get a better representation of skin tones here, at least a comparison between the two, like, you know, color science algorithms that each camera has. So I can still see that the Canon looks a little bit more red and the Sony looks a little bit more yellowish just looking at the screens. So I think the Canon is going to, again, do better in this particular test as far as skin tone accuracy goes. Sony definitely seems to be more yellow, Canon more red. Is what it is. But anyways, this is what auto white balance looks like. So it wasn't just having it hard set that was causing the problem. It looks like it's just the white balance renders differently on each camera system. So that's just what I wanted to point out in this quick clip. All right, let's move on. All right, so this is just a quick focus test in the lab here. So it's at 1/50th of a second, f6.3, and it's on auto ISO. So the ISO, when I press the shutter, is actually at 640. So if I just go to the background here, let me just click on that light in my bedroom in the back, and you can see how the autofocus works. I'll go back to the dollar bill here, and it works really well. And remember, in my previous video on the creative modes, I showed you how to change the autofocus transition speed, so you can change how quickly it focuses from the, you know, foreground to the background, for example, just so you're aware. But it looks to me like the focus is working really good. Let me see if I could focus on the lights. Yeah, did a good job. All right, and then back to that. All right, so again, here's the Sony ZV-E10. I have it at 1/50th of a second, f6.3, and auto ISO is choosing ISO 800 as opposed to ISO 640 that the Canon chose. So the exposure is a little bit higher by default on the Sony camera. Now, if I focus on the background here, just touched by that light back there, and now I'm going to go back to the dollar bill. And you can see the focus works really well. And go onto the lights there and back to the dollar bill. Alright, so what I did was I touched the screen on the quarter, and it actually just by default is going to track the quarter. So the focus box is just moving around and it's trying its best. Now I just reached the minimum focus distance threshold, so it's not going to be able to focus on the quarter, but it's still trying, which is pretty cool. So it didn't switch to the background, which is what I was wondering. And there you have it. So let me put it there for a second. Now watch when I focus on the background. And now I'm going to try to bring it back to the quarter. Now this is a really hard test. A lot of cameras struggle with this. And it can't do it. I'm clicking on the quarter and it's not doing it. Let me move it a little further away. No, it still won't do it. Alright, if I go to the dollar bill first and then to the quarter, that will work. That's usually the workaround when this doesn't work. Let me try it again. But like I said, this is hard for any camera. It's just the lights are behind it, you know, so it's just really hard to find that contrast, and it struggles. All right, let me show you how this compares to the ZV-E10. All right, so here we are. Now I'm going to touch on the quarter again, and the little tracking box came up just like on the Canon. And now when I move the door here, you can watch the quarter get tracked. And it's working pretty much exactly the same as the Canon, except the minimum focus. It looks like I'm able to get a little bit closer with this particular kit lens. But the tracking is working, I would say, equally as good on both cameras here. So let me switch to the background and see how that works. And you can see the Sony switch to the background. Let me see if the Sony will come back to the quarter. No, it won't. I'm clicking on the quarter and it will not come back. So I have to go to the dollar bill and then to the quarter, and that worked fine. So pretty much the same test results as the Canon as far as the autofocus goes. Alright, so here we are in Adobe Lightroom, and just for a baseline test here, we are looking at the Canon on the left and the Sony on the right. We are at ISO 100 raw quality in the lab. I just want to show you what raw quality looks like so you can just see the difference. And it's really close. They are very close. Sony does seem to expose just a little bit brighter than Canon by default, but again, very sharp, crisp images, and both kit lenses do an excellent job in that regard. All right, so now we're looking at the JPEGs, and you can just see how the camera processes the files. So now they look kind of similar, a little bit more as far as brightness goes, but you can see the Canon is a little bit sharper. So it looks like Canon is, by default anyways, jacking up the sharpness just a little bit on the JPEG files. But you can see the colors look great, And, you know, the background, everything else looks very, very good on both cameras. Really nothing to complain about, and they look very similar. And I do notice the colors are way more similar when compared to the video footage that you saw a minute ago, where the skin tones were way different. All right, so now we're looking at ISO 3200. Let me just zoom in here so you can see the difference. And it looks very similar, I would say. Let's go down to the shadows here. Now you can see a little bit of noise in the shadows. Let me change this to 200%. So, you know, obviously it's not going to look quite as good at 200%, so keep that in mind. But if you look at the noise here, it's looking fairly similar. Not much of a difference on these raw files. Let's go to the shadow areas over here and see what we got. So again, it looks fairly similar. All right, so here we are looking at the JPEG files now at ISO 3200. So let's click over here on the background and take a look at the difference. So you can see they still look fairly similar. Both cameras are applying pretty heavy noise reduction. I would say the Sony is looking a little bit more aggressive. Let me go over here to the pipe cleaners. The Sony looks a little bit more aggressive maybe with the noise reduction, maybe not actually. On the pipe cleaners, it looks like the Canon is more aggressive. In the shadow areas, they're looking pretty similar, I would say. So again, very, very close. All right, so now we're looking at 12,800 on both cameras. Now this is a high ISO here, so let's zoom in and see what we got. So we're looking at some pretty significant grain here. And again, the cameras are looking fairly similar. You can still read the text, but it's a little bit hard to read. If we go up to the coins, again, very, very similar. Still have pretty much the detail on the dollar. You can still make out what's going on. Let's look at the background here. It's a little easier to see the noise in the shadow areas. So pretty close. All right, so here's 12,800 in JPEG, and let's take a look at this background, and you can just see the noise reduction. It kind of gets like muddy. That's usually a description that people use, is like muddy, and you can see how it just kind of gets a little blotchy looking. And they're, again, looking pretty similar. Let's go over to the detail and see how it looks on the pipe cleaners and stuff like that. All right, it's looking very, very similar, I have to say. All right, so this is the max ISO for the Canon, ISO 32,000. Let's zoom in here and let's compare. This is raw quality. So 32,000 on the Canon is pretty similar to the Sony. Little bit more green. I'm noticing the color shift here on the Canon. I have a little bit of green here on the Sony, but in the shadow area underneath this wood here, you can really see it on the Canon. Just a little bit. Again, nothing major, but you know, it is what it is. All right, at ISO 32,000, the noise reduction is quite significant. I do see just a little bit more detail on the pipe cleaner here on the Sony, however. Just a little bit. Yeah, same thing with the text. So you can see the text there. So the Sony does have a little bit of an edge at this very high ISO when it comes to detail retention. Now that just might be that the noise reduction defaults on the Canon are higher, and we might be able to adjust for that when it comes to processing the JPEG files. But as it's looking here, I would say the Sony does have a slight advantage when it comes to detail retention at the very high ISO level of 32,000. All right, guys, so as you can see on these very basic tests I just did comparing these two cameras, they both work great. Now, in my opinion, the Canon definitely seems to have better skin tone colors just when on auto. I had the white balance hard set at 5,000, but the skin tones on the Canon definitely did look better in that particular test. Now, that doesn't mean that I can't get excellent skin tones off the Sony. You're looking at the Sony A7C right now, so it just, you know, if you're using custom white balance, you can get way more accurate colors is the point. But when you have it hard set, they are different. So that's just important to note, you know what I'm saying? But otherwise, both cameras performed excellent. The autofocus on both cameras was pretty much identical as far as I could tell. You can manipulate the autofocus transition speed on both cameras, so any difference there can be changed on a per camera basis. Also, the tracking, it worked well. And then trying to go back to the quarter, both cameras failed in that really hard test. At the slower f6.3 aperture. As far as the audio goes, they're both very good, but I did, in my opinion, think the Sony sounded just a little bit clearer as that tri-capsule in the Sony. The Canon just has the stereo. And when it comes to the higher ISO testing, both cameras performed really well, and you could take a look at the video yourself that was fairly comparable. One didn't look noticeably worse than the other, in my opinion, at the higher levels. Now, when I did the photography testing, you can see at the very highest levels, ISO 32,000. I mean, we're way up there. The Sony did have a slight edge at ISO 32,000, I would say. But other than that, it was pretty much even across the board for the most part. And then when that was comparing RAW files. When comparing JPEG, it was very similar, although the sharpness and noise reduction algorithms that the cameras apply to the JPEG files was slightly different. So the Canon at ISO 100 did have a little bit sharper of a look, but that is just how the JPEGs are processed. And you can go into each camera and configure that. So you can change those settings if you want, but at default, that is pretty much how they compared. So I really hope you guys got something out of this video, and I just wanted to show you so you can see with your own eyes and hear the audio with your own ears, and just get a good baseline of what each of these cameras is capable of. I appreciate you watching, and if you have any requests for other testing, please just let me know in the comments below. And do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up if you got something out of this video, and I'd appreciate it. All right, take care.